Managing learner appeals. So what is an appeal? An appeal occurs where a learner formally challenges the outcome of an assessment decision. Usually relates to a referral, and the learner believes they are done enough to pass, or where they believe the decision is unfair. So what causes an appeal, or why do appeals happen? Well, there are a number of potential reasons. The first one is poor assessment briefing and planning. The learner may feel that they didn't know what they needed to do, they weren't planned or weren't prepared enough to actually do what was being asked of them. So this is obviously incumbent on the assessor to make sure that their planning is what it should be. Poor assessment practice. So it could be that the assessor missed something the learner did, or they didn't record their observations or their assessments correctly or their decisions correctly, or maybe they just made an incorrect decision. Lack of standardization activity. So it could be that an assessor wasn't aware of certain changes or wasn't aware of certain approaches that the centre generally applies, have come in, done an assessment, perhaps made a referral, and the learner is not happy because other learners have passed in the past. Now this isn't usually a good reason for appeal, but it may be the reason why one occurs. It may be that the assessor and the learner between them have used a wrong assessment method. The learner was unclear of what was expected of them. Again, that may relate to poor planning or poor briefing just before they start their assessment. Again, related to assessment practice, the poor recording of assessment decisions and especially the justification of those decisions can lead to problems for assessors in appeals. It may be that the learner has not actually got good grounds for appeal, but the recording of the assessment decision is so poor it's very difficult to verify the justification for the assessor's decision. Again, it just really highlights and underscores the importance of how you write your assessment decisions down, that they are made clear, and that the feedback and the writing that you do about your decision clearly justifies the decisions that you are making. The assessor is not able to justify their decisions against the standard. Now this may come through in the previous point I've just mentioned through the recording of their decisions in a written sense, but also looking back at those records, the assessor themselves may not be able to recall why they made the decision they did. Now assessors being distracted in assessments can cause assessors to miss something the learner did, which they might then refer them on because they believe they didn't see it happen. So it's really important that the assessor sets the assessment up properly, that it's properly planned, properly briefed, that the learner is clear about what's happening, that the assessment environment is understood, and if there are distractions or other things that potentially could be going on, that the assessor manages that and prepares themselves for that should it happen. Clearly, an inexperienced assessor is perhaps a higher risk of an appeal because they might not make the correct decision first time, they might be unsure about a particular decision they are going to make. Again, IQAs will need to be aware of this and support inexperienced assessors where needed. Now sometimes appeals can be made because the learner themselves has a bad day, and they might not actually have justified grounds for appeal, but they feel they just want to appeal because they've had a bad day and they're disappointed with the outcome. Now of course, based on what I've just said, really, the assessor making sure that their decisions and their justifications for their decisions are absolutely crystal clear is really important here, because the learner might make an appeal which actually on the face of it has no justification. But if the assessment practice is poor and the justifications for the decision are not clear, the learner may have grounds for appeal. So just to summarise that, here are some pointers for best practice in appeals. That we provide the learners with a copy of the appeals procedure. Now this is generally done at the beginning of a course, but if it's only done at the beginning of a course, the learner may forget about it later on in the process. So not only providing them learners with a copy of the appeals procedure at some point, you need to tell them verbally about the procedure and what it is for. You might also discuss this at different points in the program so that they are aware of the procedure, why it's there, what it's for, and how they might access it. Now, when you are planning with learners for their assessment, this is a good time to remind them about the appeal procedure and that it's there. You don't necessarily need to go into masses of detail, but just to remind them that you told them about it before and that they do know that it's there and that it's there for them. From an IQA perspective, it's really, really important that you train assessors and other personnel whom it might affect, whether that's administrators, customer service staff, what appeals are and what to look for when a learner is potentially making an appeal or wants to make an appeal. We need to make sure that everyone, learners, assessors, and relevant admin and customer service staff have access to that appeals procedure, know where to find it, and also, based on the last point, understand its content. Now, should a learner indicate that they want to appeal or that they go straight and make a formal appeal, it's really important that assessors and IQAs respond to that as quickly as possible, and that they follow their organisations and or their awarding organisations' formal appeals process. And this tends to be a multi-step process, which we're now going to have a look at. Now, generally, in the first instance, if the learner wants to make an appeal, then they make that appeal back to the assessor that made the original decision. They might need to complete an appeal request form if that is part of the process. But either way, they make the appeal direct to the assessor that made the initial decision. And the assessor reviews their decision and feeds this back to the learner. They may decide to overturn their original decision, or they may decide to uphold their original decision. Although it doesn't say it here, if I was an assessor and I had an idea that a learner was appealing a decision, I would want to let my internal quality assurer know about that, even if at this stage it's just me reviewing my decision. Now, stage 2 is where the learner is not satisfied with the assessor's review. And if the assessor has upheld their decision to make the referral, the learner might still not be happy. And if they're still not happy, they then can refer it to you, the IQA. As the IQA, you will need all the evidence and all the information. You might want to talk to the learner, you might want to talk to the assessor. You might not at this stage, but it might be a good idea just to get an overall picture of what's happened. Then you're going to review that evidence, and then you, as the IQA, will make a decision. Are you going to uphold the assessor's decision, or are you going to overturn it? Now, obviously, if you overturn it, that has consequences for the assessor, and there may be a need for assessor training or some kind of feedback or support or remedy towards the assessor. However, you might decide to uphold the decision because you agree with what the assessor is saying and that the assessor has clearly justified their decision. Either way, once you have made your decision, you report back to the learner on that decision. Now, the learner could still not be satisfied by that and want to take this further. And it's at stage 3 where if the learner comes back and says, nope, I'm still not happy with the decision even though the IQA has reviewed it, they might want the EQA or the awarding organisation to review it too. So basically the same process applies. The EQA will get all the evidence and all the information that the IQA had. They might also want to talk to the assessor, talk to you, the IQA, talk to the learners. Then they're going to review that and they will make their decision. They'll either uphold it or they'll overturn it. They'll report back to the learner and to you and the assessor on the decision. Now, if the learner is still not happy, at this point, they can then escalate it through the awarding organisation to be reviewed by an independent group or an independent reviewer. This group or independent reviewer will again look at the evidence and make their decision. They will then report back to the learner as to whether it is upheld or otherwise. Whilst different organisations and awarding organisations may have slightly different approaches to appeals than this 4 stages I've presented here, it is a general approach that's mirrored throughout. You may find that when you write your appeals procedure in your organisation, you'll want to check that it corresponds nicely with your auditing organisation's appeals procedure also. But either way, a multi-stage appeals procedure with the ability for the learner to refer it on if they're not happy is the best approach.